Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar Weekly discussion topic video. This one's going to be all about Zuko. So just before I get into that discussion, I just want to talk about a giveaway that we have going on the site, avatarthelastairbender.online.com. The giveaway is for 2 copies of Avatar Legacy, the book from Inside Editions that I reviewed on my channel I suppose about 2 weeks ago at this stage. So if you want a chance to win that, the way you do it is that in the description is a link to a post on the site. Basically it's called Avatar Legacy Giveaway, and in there is a link to basically a special sign up page for the Inside Editions newsletter. And if you just type in, I think it's just your name, email address, I think they ask for your postal code to confirm that you're in North America, and just like what type of books you like. I think it's very simple. It only takes like a minute. Just enter that and you'll be in with a chance to win one of the 2 copies of Avatar Legacy that Inside Editions have given us the chance to give away. So link in the description to that, and it's pretty easy to follow from the post there. Only kind of caveat on this is, as I just said there, you have to be in North America for this giveaway. Wasn't my choice in any way, but that's just the way Inside Editions do their giveaways. So just be aware of that you're eligible for this giveaway once you're in North America. So yeah, let's get into Zuko now. Definitely fan favorite character, as is the case with a lot of the characters I've mentioned here, but Zuko especially, he really is one of the most popular characters in the fan base. In part, I think, because over the course of ATLA has one of the biggest character development arcs, and really kind of represents how good the show can be in terms of developing a character from episode 1 to the final episode. He goes through so much if you just kind of contrast 101 to 321. So it's just notable things like that. You are interested in him constantly throughout his journey. There are times that you get frustrated with him because he has like such a great mentor in Iroh, but for the most part, you are eagerly following him along his journey to kind of, I suppose, realize what his true destiny is and stuff like that. But as well as that, it's not just ATLA. He's probably the character who's benefited the most from the comics. The Promise, The Search, not so much The Rift, but Smoke and Shadow as well. Like, he's been like basically the most focused out of all of the comics we've got so far, and definitely has kind of changed the most since the start of those of any of our main characters. So there's actually a lot to talk about in kind of today's video. But I'll start with what I usually start out with, and that is just, I suppose, the power level of Zuko and how powerful of a bender he is, character, and so on. Obviously, he's in a powerful position, like as far as we know him, I suppose, in the current ATLA and time point, and that he's the Fire Lord, but he's definitely one of the most powerful firebenders in the world. In the sense of, at this point in time, he has the true way of firebending from the dragons, of course, as he learned with Aang. He has lightning redirection, and they've definitely set it up that at some point I think he will learn how to use lightning generation, though they very specifically haven't dealt with that since it was really brought up, that Zuko needs to be clear of mind and kind of just be aware of what's going on before he can master that technique, which is why Iroh then taught him his even more exclusive technique, the redirection. I think, we're still sort of dealing with a lot of personal issues for Zuko, in that right now, he's still dealing with some of the, I suppose, stress about people opposing him in his own nation in Smoke and Shadow. Kind of his family stuff settling down still with obviously the return of his mother. He kind of has a new kind of father figure in his life with Ikem. He has a new sister. He still doesn't know what's really up with Azula. So there's a lot of that stuff to resolve. And then still at the current point in the comics, his relationship with May is kind of a little bit all over the place as well. So there's still a few things I think holding him back from the lightning generation, and even in Korra, as far as we know, we never get confirmation either way on if he eventually gets lightning generation or not. I'd like to think he does, just because it doesn't I don't really get why they would keep it that like he was never clear enough of mind to develop this technique, in any sense. So I think that they'll definitely do something with that. But just like even in ATLA, like towards the end of the series, you have it that even in Agni Kai conditions, he could keep up with Azula. Admittedly, Azula's mental situation was a little bit off at that point in time, but just the fact that his, I suppose, dragon-style firebending could go up against her blue fire, it was impressive enough, and he was skilled enough to kind of take advantage of the way Azula was and kind of use that against her, putting her off balance and kind of using, I suppose, the advice that Iroh gives him really early on in the series, break his root, that ultimately comes back in that fight. Nice bit of writing there, but he has that. He has the lightning redirection to combat anyone who has it, given that that's kind of, I suppose, the one blind spot in his firebending technique. As I said, he doesn't have the generation just yet, but he can basically take that away from anyone because he's so skilled at the redirection. And then just like in terms of his normal firebending skills, I think he's definitely at the stage right now where he is the match of basically any firebender out there. I think Iroh, you'd have to say, is probably like, you get the sense he's kind of in that retired mode at the current stage in the comics, but if he trained up a little bit more, Iroh probably, is a slightly stronger bender just because he has everything Zuko has, plus he has lightning generation, and the only thing lacking there is obviously that he's got experience over Zuko as well, but he's got so much experience that he's actually an older character, and maybe that goes against him at this point in time. But definitely one of the stronger firebenders in terms of like firebenders who don't have a super special technique like Pali or Combustion Man. But even then, those two I feel are held back by the fact that they're so focused on their special technique that we don't really know what their normal firebending skill is like. But Zuko, really powerful. But let's move into the kind of character section of this. And again, one of the reasons I think, as I said, why people like him as a character so much is that he has one of the most clear and obvious character development arc journeys of any character, potentially like in any story anywhere. Just going from being like, in like the first 2 episodes, we think he's potentially going to be our big kind of rival to Aang villain character, but very quickly, like as in the 3rd episode, we find out that that's not the case. Zuko, as much as he's still trying to hunt down our hero characters, has a villain himself in Zhao, and that instantly kind of makes you a little bit more sympathetic towards Zuko, because you kind of gradually get the kind of situation unraveled in that, like, okay, Zuko's actually banished by his father, so he's actually in this position where he only has any sort of crew because Iroh was so well respected. Like, these people aren't here to be loyal to Zuko, they're loyal to Iroh, who obviously has a great connection with Zuko, and that's why Zuko has any sort of Fire Nation support. All the other Fire Nation characters are the kind of evil guys, basically Zhao, Ozai, and like especially when you get the backstory on what Ozai did to him and why Zuko was banished, it makes you completely sympathetic towards Zuko, because you find out that he was actually like a really good character. The influence of his mother on him growing up made it so that like if things just continued as they were, like potentially Zuko would have just changed things by default. Like if he became the next Fire Lord, he would have made some sort of a change. But obviously, the way things went, the banishment of Ursa, and obviously Ozai then kind of favoring Azula, that really kind of eliminated what happened. And especially when Zuko made the decision to speak out at that meeting, it basically gave Ozai the moment to make Azula the next in line as opposed to Zuko. And you can really tell that like Ozai sent him out on this mission without any hope that he would ever come back, and that like at that point in time, like the Avatar has been missing for like 90 something years, and he's like, if the Avatar's been gone that long, how are you going to find him? So it's this kind of fool's errand he sends him out on. But like if he succeeds, it's a bonus, and I can sort of make him happy. So it's like it really makes you turn against the guy who's actually the villain in the series, and kind of makes you see Zuko very differently. And especially the way they just develop that relationship with Iroh. It's really well done. Like moments like the storm, of course, where you get the kind of full backstory. But I think almost more important than that, you get the moment where he decides to put the safety of his crew above the goal of going after Aang. That's a big moment where like the crew begins to see him in a different way, and his crew does actually become loyal to him, and they're not just there because of Iroh. So that's a big moment for Zuko. And then gradually over the course of time, and especially in book 1, you just kind of see these moments where Zuko begins to realize how little support he is getting, and that everything he's doing here is just not working out. He doesn't have the support to really capture Aang, and just everything kind of keeps going wrong, and eventually he's just kind of like the idea of potentially ignoring that, leaving that behind, leaving behind his kind of wanting to be the next kind of crown prince, and going into like book 2, like gradually being convinced over to the side of things with Iroh that like maybe he could just start a life in the Earth Kingdom. And it's a really interesting character arc, in that like Zuko is constantly aware that he knows he can be more than he is right now. He's obviously trying to get back in his father's good graces because he believes that's what's meant to happen. But Iroh, obviously, the problem Iroh has here is that like he's aware that Zuko is doing everything for Ozai as opposed to for himself, and he's kind of trying to convince Zuko to kind of think more about what you really want rather than what your father has told you that like you needs to happen for you. So those early like book 2 episodes where Azula comes in and they have to escape from her, and they're basically on the run from the Fire Nation, and the idea really comes up of them having to kind of settle down in the Earth Kingdom to get under the radar, but also the potential that they could just set up shop there, that they could just both work in Iroh's tea shop and just have a new life there and just move away from all things royal family. But obviously Zuko wants something more. He wants to be the crown prince, and deep down that's what wants to make a change. And so it eventually happens. And so like he's constantly, obviously in book 2, the big arc is the influence of the two key figures at that point in the journey, being the good influence of Iroh on him versus the bad influence of Azula, and Azula constantly trying to manipulate him, and they're like, oh, Dad's changed his mind, he actually wants you back, and just join me and everything will be fine, versus Iroh, who's like you know what she's like, you have to make the right decision yourself. And like Azula's kind of telling him exactly what he needs to do, whereas Iroh's always been very kind of hands off with Zuko. He's very much kind of given him advice but never forced him to do anything. So it makes the moments like towards the end of book 2 where Iroh does get frustrated with Zuko and is just like, what are you doing? Like, you have no plan here. How are you possibly going to hold Appa captive? Like, what were you thinking trying to make this plan happen? It wasn't a plan. Like, that's the one moment Iroh just gets frustrated and annoyed with Zuko, what Zuko is doing, and then just kind of asks him the question, what do you want? And it forces Zuko to really make a big change. And like, they have this kind of conflict of interests manifests itself in his character as an actual physical illness, which seems like a weird concept, but it's actually really well done for him, because even going into some of the early comics, like, this is a big part of his character, and that his flaw is always that he struggles to make the big decisions. In the comics, obviously, it's about he's now Fire Lord, but he's still very young, and he still regrets a lot of the mistakes he made just months, a year ago, at that point in time of the comics. But here in the story, it's that he has kind of been back and forth. He doesn't know if he really wants to go and kidnap Aang, or if he does want to listen to Iroh and potentially settle down. And ultimately it's kind of a mix of the two, in that like he needs to side with Aang against Ozai, end the war, and then kind of change the Fire Nation from there himself. So that's really well done, and just especially when the ultimate betrayal happens, the Zuko Iroh scene, and he sides with Azula. It's a moment where the whole fandom was just like, what are you doing, Zuko? Like, everyone was actively like disappointed in his decision, and it wasn't that there were certainly people that were annoyed, but it's one of those things where you're kind of sad for him because you know he made the wrong choice, but you're kind of waiting to see what ultimately changes him around, because you really know he's not the villainous type character. And so there's the moments like very quickly, like Azula basically gives herself the escape option once they arrive back there, and saying that like, look, you, as far as you've told me, like, Aang is dead, but if there's any chance that he's not, I've told Father that you were the one who took him out. So if he turns out to be alive, you'll take the blame, not me. And she's instantly like using his return to the Fire Nation as this kind of get out of jail card with her father, and instantly like Zuko's being used again. And then it's especially like his gradual realization of what he needs to do in those early episodes of Book 3. They're really well done. Like they're mixed in the middle of kind of the gang kind of doing more kind of character driven stuff and not so much plot driven stuff, but they're really important episodes. It's like he's invited to that meeting, he thinks he isn't initially invited, then he is, and then they just kind of, he just mentions coming out of the meeting. You don't see what actually happens until much later on, but that he just comes out and says to May, you know, I was the perfect prince, I was everything my father wanted, but I wasn't me. And it's this really, really big moment for Zuko where Iroh's not around, and he just realizes himself that was kind of what I always wanted, to be by my father's side. But now that I've actually experienced what life like that is actually like, I don't actually want that, because that's not who I am. And that's such a powerful moment, and it's just a tiny aspect of that episode, but it's so well done, I think. And even stuff like in like the beach, like how angry he gets at the fact that he's so frustrated about not knowing himself what he wants to do. You know, he's angry at himself for everything he's done, not knowing what to do, and just being in general kind of confused about like decisions that he needs to make. It's really strong stuff with regards to Zuko kind of on his own, with a little bit of advice, I suppose, from Iroh as well, like getting the silent treatment from Iroh, and then Iroh eventually kind of speaking to him a little bit with the whole origin story of like Sozin and Roku. It's just very well done, you know, giving him the kind of artifact of the Crown Prince, and just kind of saying that like it's kind of Zuko's destiny to kind of make the change, and then he makes the decision to join his former enemy, the person he's been hunting for so long. And even that in itself, how different his character is from that point out, realizing that he's made the right decision, and how kind of you see how kind of awkward he is just on his own, and that like the episode where he tries to join up with the gang but makes these mistakes that kind of almost makes him more of a villain to them, but ultimately like how he saves them in the end and joins up and has to prove himself to everyone with all the field trips. It's just really well done how just like a couple of episodes towards the end of the series, he finally joins up with the crew and makes all the kind of right decisions in the end, and together they do defeat the Fire Lord, and Zuko becomes Zuko defeats his sister basically for the right to be the next Fire Lord, and Aang takes down Ozai, and Zuko's in the position he always wanted, but he did it in the right way. And in the lead up to the final battles, you had the proper reunion with Iroh, and I suppose most importantly that scene where Zuko in no way is expecting after the war to become Fire Lord, and that he says like, oh, surely Iroh, you're gonna fight, you can fight Ozai if Aang doesn't. You're strong enough to do it. And then Iroh says like, no, I can't really do it, and even if I did, I can't do it because politically it would be a bad move, and then I don't even want the role. I think someone much more newer, much better than me, and the most important line, you know, someone with like unquestionable honor needs to take it up. And Zuko then realizes that Iroh's talking about him. That's a really strong moment, that like his mentor, the person he respects most in his life, like his true father figure, so to speak, has said he has unquestionable honor, which has always been the thing that Iroh said about him, even as early as like the third episode. Like he basically, you know, at the Agni Kai with Zhao says that like Zuko has more honor than you, and that's a big moment there, and they kind of return the favor in the last couple of episodes. So that's like a big move, and it seems kind of like out of nowhere, like that this is basically the first time that Zuko has really kind of been like the idea that his character ultimately his goal is going to become Fire Lord. Like it's the first time really that it's been mentioned. I think says a lot about it, and that Zuko's quest was never really about power. It was just like he wanted his father to some extent respect him, and he kind of come to sort of see his position as the prince as like important and him needing that, but never really the idea of power becoming the leader was the idea. And so it just comes up here that like we need someone new, someone who isn't obsessed with power to become the next Fire Lord, and someone who has ideals. And at this point in time, it's Zuko, because the influence of his mother over him is much more impactful than Ozai, which, before we get into a little bit on the comics, I do want to explore this backstory a little bit more, in that when I talked about it in Azula in the video, I'm going to repeat a lot of what I said there, but more focusing on Zuko this time. So the whole gist of what I was talking about with the backstory with Azula was that the key moment when Ursa is banished, and to some extent like Azula's behavior, the influence of Ozai on her before then, basically leads to this split in the family, to the point where Azula is raised almost exclusively by Ozai, and Zuko is raised almost exclusively by Ursa. Because if Ursa didn't focus more on Zuko, he wouldn't get any attention, because Ozai doesn't care about him, because he sees Azula as the better kind of prospect to be more useful to him during his upcoming plans, because she's a better firebender initially, she's a prodigy, so he doesn't care about Zuko anymore. The other factor to add to that is obviously the fact that Ozai was the second born. Azulon clearly to some extent favoured Iroh, and so you can understand why Ozai favoured his second born as well. So that definitely factors in a bit. But Ursa, had more of an influence on Zuko, which is why he kind of turns out the way he is, and that he is more kind of idealistic. He's much more open to like the ideals that Iroh has than the typical Fire Nation power first, evil line of Fire Lords that we've seen already. Sozin, Azulon, Ozai, and then, clearly it was going to be Azula had everything turned out effectively, but everything changed because Zuko took the throne, and he was on the other side and has more of kind of Ursa's influence. And obviously Ursa comes from a family whose kind of ancestry also includes Avatar Roku, so like there's that really great connection there, that like Zuko is ultimately a descendant from like the kind of best force of good in the universe, an Avatar, and at this point in time in the Avatar universe, the worst force of evil being this evil line of Fire Lords. And that's kind of a kind of grand explanation for why he has such a hard time making decisions, and that he's always had these kind of influences in his life, whether it be Ozai Ursa or the kind of in his blood ancestry of like Roku versus Sozin kind of going on. So there's some really deep connection stuff going on there with Zuko, which really adds to the depth of his character, in that they kind of, it's not just about him, that there's also like a history going on here. So his friendship with the new Avatar, Aang, being the thing that ultimately kind of brings in this new era of peace, is a complete contrast to what could have been with Sozin and Roku, in that they were initially friends, but it fell apart, and that started the war. And ultimately it's an Avatar and a Fire Lord who started off as enemies, who then became friends, that leads to an era of peace. And it's the kind of reverse done right, but it's the same kind of, history repeats itself type thing, but this is the time it went right. In many ways, because Zuko, because of this family situation with Zuko, and that Ursa is ultimately a really important person in his life, but also Iroh especially kind of leads to those kind of changes in Zuko and the change of the line of Fire Lords going forward. And so yeah, that brings us into the comics, because the way Zuko ends the series is just like, okay, he is he's starting to date May again, which I will mention as well, his relationship with May. But He's in a relationship with May. He's the Fire Lord. He and Aang are going to start a new era of peace. He goes to visit Ozai and says, "Where's my mother?" That's the end of the series. Initially, it's like, wow, you didn't explore that, and it's kind of like, but otherwise it was a pretty nice conclusion to the series. And then as the years went on, we were just kind of gradually like, that's actually a pretty big negative against ATLA, that they just cliffhanger ended us like that and really didn't have any plans to do anything. Later we found out, obviously, Mike O'Brien wanted to do a TV movie that ultimately had roughly the same script as The Search, but Nickelodeon wouldn't let them do it, so it took time, but eventually it took fruit as a comic series called The Search. But the comics really start with The Promise, which further explores Zuko's issues with making decisions. It also explores the main theme of it, I suppose, would be the new era of leaders in the world, and how they ultimately are very inexperienced at leading, and that those leaders are basically it's Aang as the current Avatar, Zuko as the current Fire Lord, and King Kwai as the Earth King, who hasn't really been in charge his whole time as being the Earth King because of the whole Long Feng conspiracy. So you have 3 new leaders in the world who all have very little experience in leading, and you see their inexperience come out with the situation with Yu Dao and the fact that it's part of the Earth Kingdom, but the Fire Nation have had control of it for so long that they have deep history and roots in this place. And it's all about the decision about whether do you just accept this thing of war, that basically this is a town that exists because the Fire Nation took it over in a kind of war attacking the Earth Kingdom sense, or do you split it apart and give it back to the Earth Kingdom and say, like, okay, the Fire Nation were evil, we'll split that apart, but like you're putting people who have lived there for generations at this point in time apart. And it's all about the kind of toughness of that, and that like Zuko's kind of like, everything else Zuko does with regards to the Fire Nation is very apologetic to the rest of the world. He wants to make it clear that the Fire Nation are changing from here on out, but it would be really harsh to just remove every Fire Nation citizen from this place when they've lived there for potentially like 3 generations, 100 years. This being one of the first places that the Fire Nation took over. Whereas Aang is kind of like, to me it makes more sense that the Fire Nation turn it back over to the Earth Kingdom, because that's the way it was before the war, and Kwai kind of agrees with that. And it's ultimately this idea that Zuko constantly thinks he's wrong the whole time because he has such a history of making bad decisions, and so he's kind of like, oh, am I becoming like my father because I'm making this decision that the other leaders and other people don't agree with? But ultimately, like, he's actually right in the end, and you get that big moment of realization at the end where, Aang, through Katara, is gradually turned around to the idea that, okay, I wasn't completely right or wrong in that it definitely shouldn't be considered just Fire Nation anymore, nor should it be considered just Earth Kingdom. It has to be separate to itself. That is the place where the 2 nations are combined, and ultimately this is where the seeds of a United Republic come from. And obviously Kwai and Zuko at some point make an agreement to make this place separate from both nations, and eventually it becomes United Republic. So that makes sense. So it's this idea that like all of the leaders, they had their idea, they were all right and wrong in some ways, and eventually the conclusion came out very nicely for them, and Zuko realized that he's not so bad at making decisions, and for the most part that resolves that. The Search, the next comic series, is obviously about him searching for his mother, which is his 2 issues that I suppose are keeping him from having a clear head, keeping him from generating lightning, are his problem with decisions, his mother, and then what later forms from this relationship with his sister, and that he has to get Azula's help to go on the quest, and he has to learn about what happened to her and stuff like that. And in many ways, the Search here it's less really about Zuko's relationship with his mother and more about exploring Ursa as a character, because you don't really get a lot of Zuko-Ursa interaction. You get a little bit, a few nice moments towards the end, but primarily what the Search is actually about Zuko's relationship with Azula, and constantly contrasting their fractured kind of brother-sister-sibling relationship with better relationships, like new characters introduced in that series, Sokka and Katara's great relationship, and so on. And definitely you kind of see at the end of the series when Azula runs off, having not completed her mission for Ozai, that he's very concerned about this because he knows this isn't the right way for a brother and sister to act around each other, and that like they've had such a bad history together, like having fought each other effectively almost to the death in the Agni Kai. Something needs to change, and you can see that in the early Smoke and Shadow when they reveal that Zuko actually like was searching the Forgetful Valley for weeks for her, and he was really trying to kind of fix that relationship. And so when she's going to return in Smoke and Shadow, we know for a fact she will be in part 3. Part 2 is coming out in a couple of weeks. I assume at some point she'll make an appearance there. There's some very important stuff coming up with regards to Zuko's relationship with his sister. Korra hasn't spoiled for us anything that like happens between those two, because Azula's not mentioned at all in Korra. So we really don't know what's up with his relationship with Azula and where it goes from here. They're exploring his relationship with Ursa a little bit more, and his new sister Ki, which I think is really nice, and that's a big contrast right now in Smoke and Shadow. That Zuko has this really great relationship with Ki, his new younger sister. After only having known her for a couple of weeks, hugely contrasts with the sister he's known basically his whole life, who he really doesn't have a relationship with, and something is going to happen here for sure. And a lot of that is just down to mainly stuff on Azula's side of the relationship, because Zuko has shown he's kind of been open to it, and Ursa offered Azula the chance and she ran off. So it's really interesting what they do here, and that they both have to resolve Azula's issue with her mother and Zuko when she's reintroduced. But that'll be more Azula focused when it does happen. Last thing I want to talk about is Zuko's relationship with Mai. A lot of people don't like this relationship, I think partly because Zuko's such a popular character, and Mai ultimately is kind of like kind of a secondary character who kind of jumps into the main character category, kind of like Suki. I think she has an overall similar role in the series to Suki, in that she's not the most important character, but she's just about there and thereabouts. And she's a character I think that gets a lot of hate, but I ultimately think that her relationship with Zuko is like one of the best relationships in ATLA, because they perfectly suit each other in that, like, it's that kind of almost cliched thing of just, like, they're opposites in so many ways, but they actually fit perfectly together as a couple, in that Zuko's a bit highly strung. He gets a bit too overly emotional at times, and that leads to some of his problems with decision making, whereas Mai doesn't often get emotional, and so Zuko draws emotion out of Mai, and then Mai calms Zuko down, and you can see that just with she's a calming influence on him, and then he just draws some of the very little emotion you get out of Mai out of her, primarily the fact that she puts her love for Zuko ahead of her fear of Azula and stuff like that. I think stuff like that's very nice. You can see how supporting Mai is of Zuko, in that she, having allied herself with Azula for much of the story and with the Fire Nation, completely turns that around just to support Zuko. And even what she's doing right now in Smoke and Shadow, investigating her father and his organization, the New Ozai Society, everything that she's doing here, even though she doesn't say it outright, everything she's doing is to some extent to protect Zuko as the new Fire Lord, even though they're not together at that point in time in the story. Because basically their breakup in The Promise happened, I think, because Zuko had so much on his mind and just didn't have time to focus on the relationship, because he was dealing with all this world leader situations, that he had just become Fire Lord and had to make these tough decisions with regards to Yu Dao. Then the stuff with his sister came up, and mother, and searching for that happened, and now he's only just returned kind of sort of back to normal. You think they're about to get back together, and suddenly the New Oza Society comes up, and they definitely seem to be hinting at this idea that, okay, they're going to put kind of a lot of blockades in the way of them getting back together, but I do ultimately think that this is the end game relationship, and that Izumi, Zuko's daughter from Korra, who we know becomes the next Fire Lord, I think her mother is Mai. I don't think it makes any sense who else it could be. I don't think the tiny hints they have towards Zuko and Suki are really a thing, and I do think that Mai and Zuko are going to be a couple at the end of Smoke and Shadow. just because I think that's everything it's leading towards. The most emotional aspects of the story from Mei and Zuko in regards to their relationship are much stronger than what they're doing with like Kalo and Mei and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically the video. I think I've covered most of the aspects of Zuko as a character. It's one of those interesting things in that like he's developed so much in the stories and the comics, but there's still a lot more to come. In many ways, he's been the focused character of almost the Avatar, the ATLA story since the show has come to an end. Because really Aang has only been like the focus of the Rift, and even then that was more of a Toph focused story. So we haven't actually had a story that focuses like exclusively on Aang just yet. Everything ultimately has kind of been around Zuko primarily. So it's been really interesting how much focus he's been given, just because in general he's kind of a more complicated character who has more issues, I suppose, than Aang, and so there's more story to come out of him that way. So definitely one of my favorite characters. I'd say he's my third favorite ATLA character after Aang first and Katara second, but still a highly rated character for me. That's been the video. A bit longer than I usually like to do for these videos, but Zuko is a really in-depth character. There was a lot I wanted to talk about here. So if you liked the video, thanks for watching. Definitely in the comments, let me know what other discussion topics or characters you want me to discuss in the future one of these videos. I know there are a lot of people out there who seem to like these really in-depth kind of discussion videos on characters especially. So leave some suggestions in the comments below. But other than that, thanks for watching and bye.